Rainbow Bridge has served Folsom since 1917. Named after the shape it represents, this bridge has long allowed residents to cross over the American River. Historically, Folsom had a diverse community that included African and Asian Americans. Like the bridge, these communities span a void. Folsom had a vibrant and diverse existence during the latter part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. However, during much of the 20th century, the city's minorities had all but disappeared, only to re-emerge over the last 3 decades. This is their story.
When formed our band, we are well manned to journey afar to the promised land. The golden ore is rich in store on the banks of
Sacramento County began as a community for gold miners during the California Gold Rush. From these early days in the late 1840s and early 1850s to the present, Folsom has been the home to a large and diverse community of ethnic minorities who have left their stamp on the city. These groups were instrumental in the development and the growth of the city, and their presence is felt to this day, from Negro Bar State Park to Oak Chan Elementary School. The original land that Folsom now sits on was initially inhabited by the Maidu Indians, though they were driven off the land during the early years of the gold rush. While the land was settled by the Maidu, it was owned by W.A. Leidesdorff, a man of mixed race, originally from the Caribbean, who had settled in Mexican California, became a citizen, and had been given a large grant of 35,000 acres along the American River. After Leidesdorff's death, the land was bought by Joseph L. Folsom, who hired Theodore Judah to survey a portion of the grant and set up lots for sale. This town was to be known as Granite City, and lots went up for sale in February of 1856 and was renamed Folsom later that year.
Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. As oft we roam where the dark seas foam, we'll never forget kind friends at home. But memory kind still brings to mind the love of friends we left behind. Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. We'll expect our share of the coarsest fare and sometimes sleep in the open air. On the cold, damp ground
below Folsom laid the remains of a mining camp known as Negro Bar. As the name suggests, this camp was originally founded by African American miners who came to California to make their fortune. Negro Bar was also the home to many Chinese and Portuguese miners who often paired with the black miners in their search for gold. Now under Lake Natoma, Negro Bar sat near modern Old Town Folsom, where the Chinese community soon settled. Accounts differ as to how large the Chinese community was. Conservative estimates put the number at 1,200 at the height of the gold rush, while other sources go as high as 2,500. Whatever the number, the community boasted 3 cemeteries, 1 Buddhist shrine, and an untold number of businesses. One particular resident, Oak Chan, was known as the last mayor of Folsom's Chinatown. Known and respected by the community at large, he arrived in Folsom in 1850 working in the gold fields, earning only $3 a month, including room and board. Learning English, he became the chief translator in the community, as well as a banker, scribe, and shop owner. Known for his humanitarian tendencies, he would assist anyone who needed medical, housing, financial, or burial assistance. Once the gold mines were empty, the Chinese in the community took to other jobs, including the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the levees in the Sacramento Delta, and developing businesses within town. Most moved away, however, leaving the town they once called home. This decline continued well into the 20th century, when only one family was left in the town, the Chans, descendants of Oak Chan. To provide labor, other groups came to Folsom, including South Asians. The first to arrive were Sikhs from the Punjab in 1907, coming to work in the orchards around Folsom. Like the Chinese, though, exclusion eventually decreased their numbers as well. It would not be until later in the 20th century, after 1965, when quotas based on nationality were abolished, opening up immigration to the United States. Jobs were still necessary to attract immigrants to Folsom, and the opening of a research and development center for the semiconductor chip manufacturer Intel attracted a wide variety of immigrants back to Folsom. As of the 2010 U.S. Census, over 9,000 citizens of Folsom are composed of people of Asian heritage out of a total of 72,000.
मन विच वस के ना अखियां चुरा दिलोना भुलावे चन्ना दिलोना भुला मन विच वसी के ना अखियां चुरा दिलोना भुलावे चन्ना दिलोना भुला मन विच
Folsom by Ray Barrows is the source most popularly used on the early history of Folsom. This was originally Barrows' M.A. thesis while he was studying at California State University, Sacramento, and the manuscript was published by the Folsom Historical Society to fundraise for the extension of the History Museum in Folsom. Barrows begins with an account of Leidesdorff and his estate and the founding of Granite City under Joseph Libby Folsom. Barrows describes many anecdotes from the early years of the city, including the building of the railway, the local newspaper, and a brief description of the Chinese community. In this section, the tensions between the white and Chinese communities are described. In one instance, a dying Chinese man was left by his brethren in a field to die. As it was the Chinese New Year, to have a dying man in a house would guarantee bad luck for that year, so the man was left in an empty lot to expire. This outraged the white community, who saw it as an example of the inhumanity of the Chinese and their culture. It was suggested to one of the whites who vigorously opposed the Chinese presence in town that he take the dying man into his own home for a peaceful death. The man replied, "Bring him to my house. I have a good-sized outhouse you can dump him into." This work supplies interesting details about Folsom available in no other secondary resource. This piece has a glaring inadequacy. It largely leaves out the presence and contribution of early minorities. The history of the Native Americans in the region is ignored, while the presence of the African American miners at Negro Bar receives only one sentence in the entire work. Barrows' treatment of the Chinese in Folsom receives considerably more attention than the African American or Native Americans, but it is still minute compared to other subjects. The history of the Folsom Telegraph is detailed in over 6 pages, while the Chinese in Folsom receive a little over 2 pages. This can partially be explained by the era in which Barrows wrote. The thesis of this work was originally composed in 1960, while the first edition of this book came out in 1966. The civil rights movement had been underway for some time at this point, but it was a still comparatively new phenomenon, and ethnic study also just beginning to take full shape. In addition to this, Folsom was fairly homogeneous ethnically by this point, with many of the original Chinese, African American, and South Asian residents leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Furthermore, as this book was published as a fundraising tool and as meant for a popular audience, it contains no bibliography or notes, making it difficult to verify the information in this publication.
And ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. As we explore to the distant shore, filling our pockets with a shining ore, how it will sound.
In the history of the Lower American River, the work edited by Peter J. Hayes and named The Lower American River, Prehistory to Parkway, describes the area from Sacramento to Folsom in some detail. Of significance in this work is the opening chapter that describes the life and culture of the Maidu in the region. The book details the area in which the Maidu lived, its boundaries and ecology. Aspects of their culture are also described, including food, clothing, weapons, settlements, and aspects of their culture. This work also details the early contact between the Maidu and whites, including contact with mountain man Jedediah Smith. The Chinese also briefly appear in this work. Their presence in the mining towns along the American River are noted, especially in the town of Prairie City. This town, now gone, used to lie within the present-day boundaries of Folsom. It is noted that the arrival of Chinese miners in an area indicated a decline in the productivity of the mines. The reason for this is because the white miners would exclude the Chinese from mining in any area with productive mines. When the white miners believed the veins of gold to have run dry, they allowed the Chinese to take over their prospects, condescending to allow whatever scraps of gold to be found to remain in Chinese hands. This book does provide colorful insight into the history of the Lower American River. It does suffer from some deficits. While containing a bibliography, it is incomplete. The works that are cited in the section on the Maidu, which is in MLA format, do not appear in the bibliography. Furthermore, as with Barrows, the contribution of the Chinese, African Americans, and South Asians to the early development of the region is underreported. The contribution of the South Asians to the region receives one line about their presence in the agricultural colony along the river in Fair Oaks. The Chinese receive slightly more attention, as was previously noted about their presence, indicating decline in a mine, and what they noted too about tensions with the white community. The contribution of African Americans to the region is a small reference devoted to Negro Bar. The original edition of this book was written in 1977, while the current edition is from 2005. In the interim, much research into ethnic studies has taken place, leaving it unlikely that the Society did not have information available to include in this work. It's difficult to locate literature on the Maidu that is not strictly anthropological or linguistic. 3 ethno-historic references to the Maidu is a boon to the researcher looking for the history of this people. This work recounts 3 encounters between whites and the Maidu, the first recorded instance being between explorer Gabriel Moraga in 1808. Following this were the expeditions of Luis Aguirre in 1817 and trappers Jedediah Smith in 1828 and Michael Laframboise in 1832 and 33. From here, the historical record is silent until John Sutter built his fort in modern-day Sacramento in 1839. Fontana's work is more of an anthology than an original composition of research. This piece does not demonstrate any critical analysis on the part of Fontana. That being said, it is a beneficial article for the researcher to have 3 different accounts of the Maidu in one location and to be able to compare the accounts side by side.
Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. The gold is there most anywhere, we dig it out rich with an iron bar, but where it is thick with spade or pick, we take out chunks as big as a brick. Then ho, boys, ho, to California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. Then ho, boys, ho, to California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento.
A more worrisome trend was documented by Michael F. Maglieri in his article, Free State Slavery. In this work, Maglieri documents the use of Native American labor in the Sacramento Valley that amounted to slavery. Although California opted to reject slavery in 1850 when it joined the Union, in that same year, prior to its admission, the California legislature passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Because the demand for labor was so great during the gold rush and available workers were limited and demanded high wages, this act provided inexpensive Native American labor for white employers. Preserving an early Mexican law, this act allowed counties to contract Native American convicts or to obligate Native Americans into what was essentially debt peonage. Much of this labor was composed of women and children who worked in agriculture or as domestics. It is an important resource in that it depicts the relationship between whites and Native Americans. Though focused on the exploitive nature of whites, it does provide some insight into the lives of the Native Americans under free slavery. Maglieri does not approach this topic from only the legislative perspective, but he also relates stories of Native Americans under the chattel system. This allows the research some insight into the Native American perspective of the system. Rudolph M. Lapp, in Blacks in Gold Rush, California, devotes his work to the history of African Americans in California during the late 1840s and early 1850s. Lapp covers a wide range of topics about early African American miners and settlers in the state. Initially detailing this group during the period of Mexican rule, Lapp recounts the history of William Alexander Leidesdorff and of his estate along the American River that became Folsom. Leidesdorff was a highly influential public figure in early California, especially in San Francisco, where he was the treasurer in 1848 and before that a member of the city council. Unfortunately, he died in 1849, and his death set off a train of events that led to the acquisition of his estate by J.L. Folsom and the founding of the hominidic city. Also details the influence that African American gold miners had on the landscape of California, where many of the early gold miners first struck gold. Geographical expressions such as Negro Bar, Negro Hill, and Negro Flat, the first 2 located in modern-day Folsom, all bear testament to the presence of African American miners. Many of these names, though, Lapp notes, have been erased from present-day maps. Of equal importance, Lapp describes the culture of the early African American community, such as life in the mines and cities, as well as their churches and their schools, explaining what life was like for these migrants. Also detailed is the persecution suffered by the community at the hands of the white majority. Legislation was proposed in 1857 to limit the immigration of African Americans into the state, although this bill was defeated, and eventually many African Americans fled the state for Victoria in British Columbia. Gold had been discovered along the Fraser River, and the political climate was more hospitable. As a result, many African Americans left California for Canada in order to better their lives politically and economically. Lapp goes to great lengths to describe life in early California for the African American community and to detail their impact on the state. He describes their culture and persecution before and after the advent of American rule in the state. Lacking one central archive that holds records of the African American experience in California, LAP utilized the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, the Beinecke Library at Yale University, as well as numerous newspapers as primary sources. This work does a wonderful job in describing the life of African Americans in the state in general, but has little information in the way of Folsom or Sacramento specifically. By Gene Feltzer recounts the persecution of the Chinese in America, concentrating mostly on California with some reference to Colorado and Washington. The book details both legal and illegal persecution of the Chinese immigrants in the state. Feltzer records the attitudes that whites held towards the Chinese as well as Chinese resistance to persecution. Drawing from primary sources such as official government documents and newspapers, along with a wide range of secondary sources, Feltzer outlines how the Chinese were treated with contempt by their white counterparts, murdered, and run out of the state in large numbers. She recounts how the Chinese, losing their jobs as cooks, cigar makers, and shoemakers, went to the mines around Folsom, working for depressed wages just to stave off starvation. The prison in Folsom housed 145 Chinese inmates out of a population of 1,200, this being the result of towns across the state hoping to empty their jails of these detested prisoners. Canton Footprints, Sacramento's Chinese Legacy, by Philip P. Choi, goes into greater detail about the life and times of the Chinese in California than does Feltzer's work. While Feltzer focuses exclusively on the persecution of the Chinese in the United States, Choi looks at life in Sacramento for the Chinese community. The book opens with an account of relations between the West and China, as well as China's internal divisions, providing a background for the subsequent immigration to the United States. The book then goes on to focus on Chinese life in Sacramento, referred to as Yifo, or the second city in Cantonese. Life in early Sacramento is described, the living arrangements for the Chinese immigrants, and the ghetto that they lived, known as China Slow. With any book that deals with the history of the Chinese in the United States, Choi tackles the discrimination that the Chinese population faced. He relates that no factor has played so prominent a part in the history of California's labor movement as the presence of the Chinese. It was the presence of the Chinese and the competition that arose for jobs that helped to alienate the Chinese from the rest of the white population. This, of course, led to violence, discrimination, and eventually exclusion. Unlike Feltzer's work, however, Choi does not end there. He goes on to examine life for the Chinese community in Sacramento during these years of exclusion, looking at their culture and daily interactions, showing different families in the city and how they lived. Choi writes that the Chinese experience in Sacramento up to the present day, examining its evolution and growth. Choi utilizes a wide variety of sources for this work, examining government records, private unpublished manuscripts, and a large selection of secondary literature. This holistic work allows the researcher to examine life in Sacramento for the Chinese community without focusing solely on the discrimination and persecution suffered by the community. Daniel Leistman, in his horizontal interethnic relations, Chinese and American Indians in the 19th century American West, examines the relationship between Chinese Americans and Native Americans. He begins his account with the description from San Francisco of a Native American who was hanged for killing a Chinese man. The article notes that white men weren't usually hanged for killing a member of the Chinese community. While Leistman begins by noting the contradiction between justice administered to Native Americans and that given to whites, he quickly shifts focus to interethnic relations between the Chinese and Native Americans. He notes that this has been an often overlooked relationship, with much of the focus on relations between whites and various ethnic groups. One form of interaction was through a common lingua franca, in this case a pidgin English. Leistman notes that initial interaction between the groups was devoid of an agenda on the behalf of the Chinese, who sought to neither kill nor convert the Native Americans. From this lack of prejudice in the beginning, archaeologists have found a multitude of Chinese coins, pottery, and other artifacts at Native American settlements. In Arizona, the Yuma, who did not eat fish, would sell what they caught to the Chinese workers. Of course, not all interaction was peaceful. Along the Salmon River, 2 Chinese laborers were captured by the Colville tribe. Knowing them not to be white or Native American, the conclusion was reached that the men were demons. The tribe promptly dispatched the supposed Hellions. As Leistman points out, these relations were not always clear-cut, at times more violent than others. What is clear, though, is that Leistman attempts to look at interethnic relations in the late 19th century outside of the usual framework of whites versus everyone else. This perspective is refreshing and will add understanding to the research paper as to how the various ethnic groups in Folsom may have interacted with one another. Juan L. Gonzalez, Jr., writing in International Migration Review, details the beginning of the South Asian community in California. Beginning in the first decade of the 20th century, the original South Asians in California were Sikhs from the Punjab. Many settled in Northern California, drawn to the region because of its similarities to the Punjab in weather and geographical conditions, and that many of the agricultural products that they grew in the Punjab were also grown in Northern California. While South Asians had been in the United States since the 1820s, these numbers were statistically insignificant, consisting mainly of sailors and diplomats. Immigration, though, began in earnest between 1902 and 1906, when over 800 South Asians came to the United States, with the first coming to the Sacramento area in 1907. They were employed in agriculture, and Folsom's orchards and farms proved to be an attraction for them. Facing much discrimination from politicians and the newspapers, as well as from labor unions, the nativists succeeded in halting immigration for a spell. From 1915 to 1945, immigration fell off drastically, resulting in the decline of the South Asian community in California. It wasn't until after the Second World War and the easing of immigration restrictions in 1966 that South Asians returned to the United States in meaningful numbers. Gonzalez goes on to examine this revitalization of immigration to the United States by the Sikhs, showing that California in 1980 held the second largest community of South Asians in the country. Gonzalez gives an insightful account of the origins of the Sikh community in California. In numerous instances, Gonzalez specifically mentions the arrival and activities of the Sikhs in the Sacramento Valley and in Folsom specifically. One weakness in this essay, however, is his bibliography. Gonzalez relies heavily on secondary sources, utilizing only one primary source in the entire article. The topic of this thesis will focus on ethnic minorities in Folsom, California from the 1840s to 1920, along with a glimpse of the current population and standing of these minority groups. I will examine the local Native American population, African Americans, Chinese, and South Asian settlers in Folsom. There is little controversy in this topic. It is agreed that these groups of people were present in Folsom, that they arrived to work in the mines or in the orchards, and that they were often treated poorly by the white majority. What is important to note about this topic is the lack of research on ethnic minorities in the city. While there has been some research on the Chinese, as of yet there has not been a comprehensive study of ethnic minorities in total for the city. This is a major oversight, especially when considering how important these groups were to the creation and success of Folsom. It is the intention of this paper to rectify this oversight and to incorporate the history of ethnic minorities into a larger context of ethnic minorities in California during this time frame. The best interpretive frame for this essay is the ethnographic approach. This is not to say that those ethnicities not mentioned did not bring anything to the table. It is instead meant to shine a light on certain groups that have historically been neglected from the record. I hope to shed light on a little studied but important aspect of Folsom's history. The Anal approach will also be visible in my paper. In order to have the best understanding of this topic, I will need to look as far back in time as possible, examining the ecological and geological formation of Folsom to gain an understanding of the environment that the Native Americans lived in and what it was in the land that attracted settlers, especially miners. Furthermore, I will need to approach this paper with the help of the social sciences. Anthropology, archaeology, and some sociology will augment this paper tremendously. There is little in the historical record on the Native American tribes in California, but there is an abundance of archaeological evidence, and there has been much research done on the Maidu by anthropologists, especially Dr. A.L. Kroeber. A sociological approach will also be used in order to establish how the various communities interacted with one another. Problems with a written thesis is that it is rather narrow in its ability to communicate. While words can paint a picture, it lacks the impact of actual media. It is difficult to gain an understanding of a landscape or a person when the reader cannot see the face of the earth or person being described. While this allows for the flexing of the imagination when trying to convey accuracy, as any good thesis should do, such flexing of the imagination makes it difficult to attain that historical accuracy demanded of the science. In order to correct this quandary, I propose to supplement my written thesis with a multimedia project. It is not my intention to replace one project for another, but rather to make this thesis project a truly multimedia one by using various forms of communication. As expected by the field, I do intend on writing a full thesis, but I also intend on creating a documentary on my subject in the school of Ken Burns. It is the intention of the researcher to use various forms of media to flesh out the subject in ways that pen and paper cannot communicate. The most obvious way of doing this is to use photographs. As the cliche goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I would have to agree with this. Photographs are able to communicate what words cannot. One cannot truly understand rage, anger, hardship, or other environmental factors through only words. Photographs clearly show anguish, turmoil, and other emotions, allowing the viewer to connect with the subject. Of course, photographs cannot be effectively used without a context. By showing a photograph, but without providing context, renders the picture meaningless. To correct this, I intend on narrating this multimedia project. By placing pictures in the correct context through narration, the impact of the photograph will be made all the greater. Connected to this is the use of music. Using music from the time era, and in this case, music specific to the minority groups, can help engage the viewer, drawing them into the era that is being viewed. Ken Burns used this to great effect in his documentary, The Civil War. I still often find myself humming Battle Cry of Freedom to myself with the haunting notes of the piano in my mind's ear.
When formed our band, we are well manned to journey afar to the promised land. The golden ore is rich in store on the banks of the Sacramento shore. Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. As oft we roam where the dark seas foam, we'll never forget kind friends at home. But memory kind still brings to mind the love of friends we left behind. Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. We'll expect our share of the coarsest fare, and sometimes sleep in the open air. On the cold, damp ground we'll all sleep sound, except when the wolves go howling around. Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. As we explore to the distant shore, filling our pockets with a shining ore, how it will sound as the shout goes round, filling our pockets with a dozen pounds. Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. The gold is there most anywhere, we dig it out rich with an iron bar, but where it is thick with spade or pick, we take out chunks as big as a brick. Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento. Then ho, boys, ho, for California, oh. There's plenty of gold, so I've been told, on the banks of the Sacramento.